Thank you so much for having us here, Shaw. I was really excited when you asked us to do this talk because I had actually just recently purchased a book called by Octavia Butler, a few predictions, a few rules for predicting the future. So I literally brought this maybe like a few weeks before she had asked me to do this conversation. So I thought it was really, really perfect and great timing. So while we will be talking about our big read book, Fahrenheit 451, which you can see here, I will also be using this book as sort of a guide through our conversation. And this is a conversation and an open dialogue. So we will have like a community dialogue discussion part at the end, but please feel free to chime in at any point as we're talking. If something comes up for you, if there's a book, a movie, or something that resonates, you have a question that you want to pose, not just to us, but to the room, please feel free to do that. We are not experts in anything here. We are just having the conversation based off of things that we've read, that we've seen, to really connect, as Shaw said, science fiction and how this genre that people seem to think is fake often really is sort of predicting the future. Yeah, anything you want to add in that intro, Josh?
Oh, I always, try to embrace my nerdy side, right? But I say, through a lot of what we've seen and a lot of what we're entertained by, there's always those undercuts of the truth, and those undercuts of reality. So even in me, like being a big Star Wars big nerd fan, uh, Star Wars is a space opera about politics, right? So those are like the fun kind of conversations that we usually found ourselves in. So when Shaw did reach out, was like, "Hey, can you do this?" And I'm like, "Oh, this is my jam." So not only just being excited to have the convo, but also, yeah, excited to hear from you all, your own interpretations, maybe your thoughts about this, because like what Ada said, it's great to have more of these dialogues where we can talk and just discuss these things, and just highlight these orders that we need to read more.
Yeah, so to start off, we'll just give you, if you haven't read the book, quickly what it's about, and then we have a clip from the 2015 movie, um, 2018 movie, that will show. It's a brief 2-minute clip. But basically, in Fahrenheit 451, it's a world where firefighters, so actually fighting fires, they burn books. And so it's a story about this one firefighter who kind of become disillusioned with this idea. Like, why are we doing this? Why are we destroying this knowledge? And sort of rebels against that. So that's the general outline for the book. You don't need to know anything about this book for this discussion, but just so you can have a little bit of background and context to some of the ideas that the author was thinking about when he was writing this book. All right. So one of the great things that I found when reading this book was a quote from Octavia Butler. And I think it really connects sort of the introduction that's in Fahrenheit 451. So if anything, when I was thinking about this conversation and putting it together, the introduction by Neil Gaiman really talks a lot about what the author was thinking about when writing this book, as well as how science fiction tells the future. So if anything, really read the introduction. It's really great. But Octavia Butler says in this book, I didn't make up the problem. All I did was take a look at the problems we have now and give them 30 years to grow into full-fledged disasters. And so that's really what science fiction or speculative fiction is doing, right? It's not creating problems. It's not making up something new. It's really looking at the current time, or maybe even in the past, finding an issue, right? And then imagining how that issue festers and how does that grow over 30 years and what that's going to look like. And so I found that to be a really good starting point for our conversation there.
Yeah, definitely. From the clip that we wanted to show you, it actually talked about them visiting schools, and it's the firefighters in the schools like talking about, hey, this is contraband, right? Pointing out the contraband, and as well as you can see the propaganda. But when you talk about just giving it 30 years, to this book was written when you're looking at what was happening in Nazi, what's happening in Germany. And just the little things of when you take control of the information, take control of the media. I think about how big and powerful radio was at this time, right? Uh, to the point where there was a sci-fi radio show that had people so shook they thought there was actually going to be like aliens attacking. And just to imagine that, radio at one point was that powerful that, people that are like from the cities really think that this is a nest of what's happening and occurring. So when you just add that into now 30 years, 50 years later, where Google just dropped that their AI videos can now chat and look very human. And now you have those people that are looking at those videos like, oh, now it's hard for me to tell what's real or not. We were watching Love, Death, Robots, and we thought it was a clip of like a CGI scene. And it was like, oh, no, this is the real scene. But it just shows you how far technology has come as well. So it's very interesting thinking about how much technology can play as well as media and our information and power at the end.
Speaking of media, that was one of the concerns Bradbury had when he was writing this book. So, of course, he was, inspired by the book burnings during Nazi Germany. This book was also much a commentary on how mass media reduces interest in reading, right? And so the more media we have, the less people seem to be reading and picking up physical books. So that was also one of his concerns that he was talking about. And he was also really concerned about political correctness, all right, as an allegory for censorship, and calling it the real enemy of these days. So, one of the concerns in the book that people had was, there's too many opinions. They were afraid of being right or saying things wrong. So instead of, allowing that freedom, allowing controversy or discussion, right? Because there's nothing wrong necessarily with opposing views or having a conversation or even disagreeing, right? They were so afraid of that they decided to just get rid of the issue by, burning these ideas, by burning books. And so that was one of the things that he wanted to talk about in Fahrenheit 451. And sometimes we take a lot of things that we value for granted. We take the ability to pick up a book, to go to a library, right, where we have these resources that are available for free to us, and utilize them. And then, one day they could be gone. And so like those are some of the things that he wanted to warn us about and talk about within this book.
Yeah. I think an interesting quote you talk about political correctness because one of my favorite Martin Luther King quotes is him saying that the most dangerous person in America is not the outright racist, it's the moderate. It's the moderate white person that is afraid to make people uncomfortable, have the difficult conversations. And, me working in education, Lord knows how many times, have challenging conversations, have uncomfortable conversations. And then when you bring things up, it's like, oh, well, maybe not now, right? So I do find sci-fi is a good reminder to get into some bit trouble, right? So that I always say that, like, talk about the thing, say the thing if you're uncomfortable. For my students, I remind them to hold me accountable if I ever do or say something that needs to be addressed. And, like you said, there is a lot of the allegories that get warning signs. And it's also a good way to hold people's feet to the fire when they may see, and I would of the Elliot. But when people like say a commentary about something sci-fi, and you're able to hold the mirror up and be like, oh, but why does this make you uncomfortable? Why is this the thing that's really sticking with you? And it's also a way that people try to hide behind. Like, oh, it's not real, it's sci-fi. But no, but you have real feelings and the real contradictions that are coming out while you are addressing it, talking about these. Definitely.
It's interesting point when you talked about people will look at this and be like, well, it's just a movie or it's just a book. It's not real. And, a lot of times it's like, well, no, we're trying to tell you something, right? And we think about this when we think about, there's this TV show called The Boys, and there's a character there. It's about, people with powers. And there's a character there that kind of represents, you would kind of imagine of like a Superman type of character, like just, overpowered. He's called Homelander. And people thought that he was supposed to be a hero. like the general public and everyone else who kind of got the point of the show. And it's like, no, Homelander is a bad guy. Like, he represents sort of the destruction of sort of free will, the destruction of, government, not destruction of government control, but of government control. He represented all of these ideas that we think the producers are trying to tell us or warn us about. And people were like, oh my God, I didn't realize that this play is about us. Um, it's like, yes, no, this actually is about talking about our current times. And that's what sci-fi is meant to do. So one of the other things I found really interesting in the introduction of this book was they talked about there's sort of three phrases that really put the structure together for speculative fiction. How do you begin to tell a story in that kind of way? And so those three phrases are, if this goes on, what if only. And so when writing this book, one of the things that Bradbury, started with was, if this goes on. So, if this goes on, talking about, the book burnings during that time, if this goes on, what if, we continue burning all of the books, right? That was sort of the first part of that phrase. And then he asked, what if? What if firefighters didn't fight fires and burn books, right? And the third part of that is if only, right? So if only there was someone there to stop this, to change this. And so I thought that was a really interesting way to give structure of how we begin to tell a sci-fi story or a speculative fiction or to predict the future.
So I'm not gonna lie, when I first saw this, I was like, oh, I'm still in this. Whenever I have writer's block, like just stopping and being like, if this goes on, what if? Um, Another term that came to mind, I know it's super random, but the South Park writers talk about like, if this happens, therefore this happens, and just talking about the continuance of the understanding. And even now, we're talking about burning books, the Library of Congress, right? Right now, just trying to scan books and so that people can have access to them, the head of the Library of Congress was fired, right? And this also brings it to that next level of what is just controlled in general, right? If they controlled audiobooks, digital books, like just having access to those or not having access to those as younger folks. I always think about working now in academia at a university. For many students, they're not able to even access these research documents without a university email or without like paying tuition. So there's a lot of times I really have those moments of thinking about, well, what if all this information was free, right? If all this if everyone had access to this, or if only people had access to this. So not only does this give me a great sense of like ways that we can create and write those allegories to point out those things, it also makes you recognize the roadblocks for a lot of things, right? Because when I'm having these conversations with Lord, the comments of the Instagram that I'm trying to stay out of, I'm like, if only you could have like set in this, contemporary Black poetry class I was in, right? If only you could have, had this experience I had at a HBCU, right? Then it would have really like changed your lens of the world, right?
Uh, the what if question makes me think of, there's a show called What If. So again, if you are a Marvel fan, they have this animated show called What If. So it kind of takes all the stories from the characters that we're used to from the Marvel movies, and they write different stories for them. They put them in different universes and poses the question, what if? And so like that's just one of my favorite ways. And like you said, I love this structure. And using that, I think it can be really useful in many sort of in many fields, in many ways of thinking when we're trying to come up with solutions or write a story, whether it's poetry, whether it's speculative fiction, whether it's history, going through these sort of three questions and posing and seeing all the opportunities and the pathways that could exist, based off our current circumstances.
It also is great to like remove a lot of the limitations we put on ourselves, right? So what if I got back from work and I wasn't so tired that I couldn't start writing this book, or What if only, I left a little early here so I could put some more time to be creative or to pick that book up, right? I even try to say it as well when you're talking about people not reading books as much. I always try to remind people to just consume it however, right? So if you still pick that audiobook up, if you got that YouTube conversation, passive ways that you can pick up the knowledge as well.
So one of the first steps that Olivia talks about in in this book is learning from the past, which I think is really key, really a starting point, I think, for anything, but particularly when we're talking about the future, right? There is no future without our past. And so she talks deeply about when she's starting any research for any book is learning from the past and researching that. And one of the interesting things that she talks about, she recaps a story of a 15-year-old girl who couldn't pronounce the word Nazi, because she didn't know anything about them, right? So she was trying to ask questions, and she was just really unfamiliar with the word, which is very clear when she was, trying to talk about it. And that can be a really scary thing when we start realizing that only, less than 100 years removed from, such a huge world history, that people are starting to forget already, right? That we are not sharing and passing down information and knowledge to different generations. And then that's when we see things, we see that cycle of history repeating, these things happening again when we're not uh, studying our history. And I really love the quote by Octavia. Sorry, I said Olivia earlier. Octavia Butler. To study history is to study humanity, which I think is a really important reminder when we're really doing anything together as people in community.
I actually want to give you and Erica a lot of credit. Me, teaching in high school, now working with college students. A lot of times I come back and I'm the grumpy professor. I'm like, oh my God, like these kids. Da, da, da. And a lot of times you guys give me that reminder, like, well, they're young. They don't really know any better about this. And I think about this when we talk about the history and the humanity. It's sometimes you also just assume that the younger generation knows. Like, of course you guys know about this. Of course you've heard about this, right? And then in the conversations I've had in the classroom, I remember talking about experiencing 9/11. And then I was like, yeah, well, this happened. And they're like, what? And I was like, oh, this affected, what's it called? Our finances, and it affected my college, and it affected what I did for my major. And I'm sitting here with teenagers who are just kind of looking at me crazy. And I'm like, oh, let's remove everything we're going to talk about today, and we're just going to talk about what this was like for us. And even now, right, you talk about the Middle East and Gaza, like these are not things that are just happening this year, last year. These are years in the making of things that have happened, that either one, we're shrinking from the conversation. I know that, and like people already got a little quiet. But like we even just talk about that, more that we can have spaces to acknowledge just the humanity in each other, right? As well as to listen to and share that knowledge with the younger generation, and give them more credit. So, even times when I'm in my classroom and yes, my students are getting on my nerves, I'm like, no, cool, let's have this combo, let's have this dialogue, and what questions you guys may have. And now we can identify those blind spots that we can have more conversations about.
And continuing on that quote, just wanted to read, Octavia says, and to try to foretell the future without studying history is like trying to learn to read without bothering to learn the alphabet.
Octavia with the bars, like I, it's hard to have these discussions when you know you don't take the time to really look back and understand like the rationale of a lot of people, right? Because even when people are saying like, oh, this is unlawful, it's also like, well, yeah, laws are made up, right? There's been times in the past where we had to deal with laws that were unlawful, that when it gets humanity, uh even in the aspect of I'm a big Star Wars fan, like my father before me. There's a lot of times I realize my dad enjoys Star Wars so much, as well as him serving in the military. There's a lot of parallels he talks about from like his experience in the military and seeing like Star Wars to even now you have young folks that are like the empire is bad. What that? Yeah, like so it is that sense of like taking the time to learn from the past as well as to really teach our generation. And even in Germany, it's a big thing where they teach their kids not only their past, but they're ashamed of it to the point of trying to strive to do that. Right. And that's something big when we talk about coming back to the stats, or
Yeah, and that's really important right now when we're thinking about uh critical race theory being banned and things like that. When we talk about, oh, the kids are too young to hear about this, or and it's like, well, no, if we don't talk about it now, when do we talk about it? And so, yeah, it's really scary the times we are when people are actively trying um to erase history, really, at that point. One of the strongest sort of forms of sharing information is through oral tradition, is, books we have, but also being able to share via word of mouth is also it's really important in these days and times as well. Yeah, and so the next sort of rule that Octavia has is actually, I wanted to go back 1 second, just talking about, again, the past, being someone that identifies as an Afrofuturist, a futurist. A lot of people think that that means just thinking about the future. But it's really important, I think, even more so, that a lot of futurists spend a lot of time in the past, right? And we really look at time not as this linear sort of representation that we often think of when we see a timeline, right? We really look at, time as more of this circle, this sort of evolving thing that comes around, right? And so when we're thinking about, predicting the future, being a futurist, being future minded, that's never without being grounded in our history, being grounded in our past and the present at the same time.
well, and I know I pull random quotes out. Um, Someone at my job said, "Tradition is worshiping the flame, not the ashes." And that's like a big part of it where you can get so caught up, like who said, trying to go to the future, try to like see what we can do next, but and not really taking that time to like or why we are in this state. That so absolutely.
So the next rule that Octavia has is respecting the law of consequences. And so really what this means is that everything that we do has a reaction to it, right? Everything that we touch, everything that we see has an effect. And remembering that and respecting that as well. And so in this book, she gives a really good example of going to the doctor. And so she's having side effects from a medication. And so the doctor's answer is to put her on another medication to help her with the side effects of the first medication. And the doctor tells her, "Oh, there's no side effects for this second medication." And Octavia's like, "Well, that doesn't make sense to me, right? That doesn't seem real. Everything has an effect, right?" And so that's really what she's talking about with this, respecting the law of consequences.
Yeah, it was, thinking about how long ago I table about where these other resurrect situations and just like long term uh issues with our healthcare. That's also been a big thing that in the past a lot of underrepresented communities talked about the discrimination in the medical field as well. I always think about, what are ways that we can like take care of ourselves. I have a friend that's in the gym and she leads a lot of workouts and everything else. So it also makes me think about, well, I'm stressed because I'm exhausted of consuming like this media, consuming this social media. It is like, well, I need to unplug more. I need to go outside more. Even like classes talking about, even in college, we're just gonna go outside. Just go outside, breathe, do some meditation. Like those are like things I also think about of how are we taking care of ourselves and how much is what we're consuming, the consequence of, spending too much time on screen, or that's Lord knows I can say my screen time right. So
Well, I think not to, get into everything, but that's part of what I think the systems that we live in, when we think about capitalism, we're thinking about these systems, like part of it is to keep us tired, right? If we're tired, it's harder to fight back. It's harder to think. It's harder to dream, right? when we're exhausted. We just worked all day. Now you want me to come home and think of solutions, to dream of the future, to be hopeful, right? I think that's part of this cycle that is designed to keep us in this way. And so just thinking about this quote, all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The lasting truth is change. That's a quote from Parable of the Sower. And it was really poignant because it really connects directly to our protagonist in Fahrenheit 451. And so Montag's journey is really a living illustration of this quote, because he starts picking up this book, physically touching them and reading them and looking at them, and that sets off a ripple effect. And it starts to get him to question and to want to change, and that change sets off, another transformation to the point where in the book, after the city is destroyed by war, he joins a group of scholars who are committed to preserving knowledge, right? And so I thought that was just really important when we think about even just the physical touch of him, picking up a book and the change, that ripples after that. So I think about that. If there's any like books that have really ever just really affected you, or something that you saw that kind of was that spark that could be that moment of change, I thought that was really important to highlight here.
Yeah. I also think about how a lot of times we can be in the thoughts of like, I need to read this book, I need to get this routine, I need to do these things. And we can make it like a big mountainous like thing that's hard to do. When really the change is increments, right? So from how can I consume this book? Oh, well, let me find the audio. If there's not audio, let me find someone just talking about this book. And this can give me encouragement. I'm not gonna lie. I do enjoy my throne time. I was like, let me put books right next in my bathroom. And like it'll encourage me to use the downtime that I have to at least read some of it. I had a friend that was in theology school and she learned someone explaining just read the first sentence of each error, right? Just go through, start digesting some of it. And really that's like when I think about what be the change, what changes you, right? Sometimes it's just those little things. Talking about the book that I want to read, starting to go through it, finding folks that hold me accountable. Like those are the little things that really start building on top of each other to where again, I just saw this book and I was like, oh man, one, it's a pretty cover. Like that's a dope cover. What is this? And I was like, oh, the future. And I was like, okay, like I need to ask Juanita about this to the point where we had a whole conversation about it. And it was just from we looking at it, being interested, intrigued, and then scoured the internet. And I'm like, yeah, I'm buying this. Right. And that was, like you said, weeks before we even had this conversation. So incremental changes could go a long way to build to that bigger change as well.
I think for me, an example of, a moment that I can cite that really changed the way I thought. So a lot of people ask me, like, when did you get into Afrofuturism? Like, how did that come to be? And so for me, I remember I took a workshop. It was a virtual workshop that I took at Connecticut College. And it was presented by this, world-renowned Afrofuturist called Ingrid LaFleur. And the name of the workshop was called How to Think Like an Afrofuturist. And so that, when I tell you that workshop completely sort of opened my mind to a new world of thinking, a new world of being, I cite that as a very fundamental like moment and change in terms of my art practice, in terms of how I look at my work, how I look at my community. So I think when I think about this quote, I think about moments like this. I think about these small interactions, even conversations that you have with people. You never know that those things, those moments that you're touching people, you're touching other things around you, what those effects are going to be.
I got to add a little bit. Then it went from you having that to years later, you doing the summit, right? Being able to now have those conversations with those types of people too. So even like you said, that one, what's it called? Event that you had got to visit virtually really had these years later grew into whole summit that you're in. So definitely kudos to you. I know. Why I gotta brag? Why you don't like me bragging about it? So,
So the next point in these rules that we have is being aware of your perspective. And I think that's really important in really in any aspect of what we're doing, but particularly in relation to predicting the future. Understanding that how the moment we're in, right, affects our outlook on life and it affects those predictions, right? So understanding how fear, how hope, depression can affect what we're sort of predicting for our futures. And so, as we talk about Fahrenheit 451, being in that moment for Bradbury was looking at Germany and looking at the Holocaust and looking at those book burnings, and that was where that came out of for this. Something I think about, I might have had this later in the slides, but it's coming up for me right now, is most people are familiar with the show Black Mirror. If you're not, it's an anthology show, so each episode is independent and different for the most part. And it really focuses on technology, and sort of oftentimes sort of the negative parts of technology. It's called Black Mirror because it's referencing like our black screens. This is the Black Mirror right here. Uh, so it's a really great show. It's on Netflix if you haven't seen it. I saw this post recently that talked about what if there was a white mirror. So a show that talks about the positive sort of effects of technology. And so that really got me thinking. I actually kind of want to pose this to you all and let you guys answer this. Do you think that having a show that shows technology in a different light, will that affect human behavior differently? How like influenced do you think we are by this, right? So oftentimes the purpose of these things are to be warnings, right? But then we seem to be doing the things anyway. It's like we're completely, ignoring the warnings or falling into the patterns of what, these things are trying to warn us against. Do you think there would be a reverse effect if there was more positive, representation of technology? So instead of showing all the bad things that could happen, what if you were showing the good things that could happen?
So I did see that post when they first said it, and I'm a big Black Mirror fan, so I was like, no, like you don't need to do that. But I did stop to think about that as well, because when I think about representation, right? And even we were talking about the medical field. I think about representation in the medical field and how we know it's very underrepresented, right? But I had heard a story about an individual who was a surgeon, and someone had to go into surgery, and she was very worried about her hair. She was like, I don't want to cut my hair. This is that. I'm not sure what's going to happen. But she went in prepared to get her hair cut. Woke up, hair was fine. Stitches were fine. She could barely even see the stitches. Come to find out, her surgeon was a Black man with like 3 daughters. He's like, oh, I'm very used to this. I do the hair all the time. Had braided her hair, had did the incisions because she had to get them done on her head in a way where no one could see them, and then cornrowed and braided it, right? And yes, when we're talking about the establishment of, medical field versus I get this like pocket of a story that makes me feel really good about reasons why we need to have this representation. I do think it's good that we highlight those forms of technology. However, it is just as important, if not more important, right? That we make sure we talk about, yes, the challenges of AI, these things that are happening as warnings. I think that if I think also people forget in those same anthology series, they are showing how the technology helps. There's times where like they solve cases with the same technology, right? And there's different ways that you can see the advancement of the technologies. I think, however, yes, we sometimes can get stuck on those negative aspects in those bits as well. But I think that's a great question.
And that was something I remember hearing a couple years ago about Black Mirror when they were, talking about how they come up with the concepts for the episodes. And the thing is, like, they're like, a lot of this technology is really here already, right? And so, going back to that first initial quote where, Octavia talked about just speeding up our problem 30 years, a lot of the things in Black Mirror are only probably 10, 15 years out, if anything. So people look at these things and be like, oh, well, it's not that bad, even though Handmaid's Tale, I'm like, we're really not that far off from a lot of the things that's happening in that book, in that show. So yeah, it's coming. Uh, it's not that far.
Or respond to the tricky as well. I think about, Star Trek was at a time like what first generation. LeVar Burton was in space, and for a lot of folks that can say, "Oh, there's a black man on the station," right? It also made them look at, well, in space at least, like they're integrated and they're doing these things, right? I do see that it could also be that other side of it, right? Well, one day we'll get there, right? Eventually, we're working there, right? So yeah, I think it is a little bit of both of those things, right? It can give you like that portray of that future that you'd like to see. However, it can pacify folks into thinking, well, yeah, we gave you LeVar Burke, everything's good, right? So it is very interesting. And when you talked about technology that's already here, I had the point, and I think it just slipped my mind. Um, I do think about, oh, yes. There's a app that you can get if you all have Legos. How many of y'all like playing with Legos? There you go. If you dump your Legos on the floor, you have an app and you can literally scan it and it will count all the Lego pieces, identify all the Lego pieces, and it'll say these are all the things that you can make, right? Dope. Dope thing. I just sent that to Juanita, right? However, it's like that's something we'd love to highlight, but this technology is being used to scan folks' identity and then mark where they're at. And, we've had artists, musicians that people use technology to find where they're at, rob them, and someone lost their life, right? So it's one of those things of like, we would love to talk about the Legos, but this technology is also being used for like nefarious reasons, right? So it does get to that point of, I know we'll talk about like the Iron Man amputee arm that we want to highlight, that these are like real things that are also affecting people. So you get into that issue of uh, trying having to bring the attention to the dangers of something and not being able to highlight like the positives of it as well. But yes, shout out to my Trekkies because I know LeVar Burton talked about that.
That's really interesting point though, because a lot of technologies, are built for this a specific reason. And oftentimes they may have, good intentions for, the reasons why this was created. And then again, the systems that we live in, capitalism starts taking over. We start thinking about the money that we could make if we, sell this. It's always art, it's always weapons, it's always, controlling population, gathering information, right? These are all the things when we think about the government that they can use to monetize or to control. We start seeing the technology that was, created for something that's as joyful as, Legos being used to then, identify people or trap people or do other things. So that's also really interesting.
Yeah, be about by Batman, Dark Knight. That was an allegory for George Bush. A lot of people missed it. Like he had used everybody's phone to scan the area and find the Joker. But Morgan Freeman was like, this is immoral. Like, I'm quitting. I'm not working with you. And people, I know, like, we'll talk about Batman as well. Like, oh, but Batman's dope. It's like, yeah, but that's the government scanning your phones, like doing these things. So it is those senses of, since used for something good, but it has an effect, as Reefer's. But
One of my favorite things about speculative fiction, not even so much in terms of predicting the future, but of like rewriting the past. I think that's one of my favorite ways that speculative fiction can be used of. So I'm thinking of two movies right now that had two very different endings. I try not to give too much away in case you haven't seen them. But are just really important in terms of like how you tell a story and the impact that you can have, versus that. So first, I'll start off with Queen and Slim. Not necessarily speculative fiction at all or anything, but that's basically like a retelling of a Bonnie and Clyde kind of story, with two black characters, two dark skinned black characters, which is very important. And so when watching this movie, I really hoped that we were going to get a different outcome, right? I'm like, well, we've already heard Bonnie and Clyde. Like, we know what happens in that story. Why do we need to tell that story again? And the writer, the director disappointed me so bad because we got the same ending, right? And I was just like, we could have imagined something different, right? We could have imagined, something more beautiful where they got away, where they escaped something, I craved for that imagination of a different future, a different element. There's so many different, as this quote says, a billion different variables that can happen. I really hoped that they were going to give us a different variable. Um, and so to contrast that to, I got to talk about Sinners really quickly. that just came out. And so again, I don't want to give away that movie's much more new, but the ending of that movie, which if you know, you know, if you don't, I'm not going to say it. But just just the fact that they gave us that at the end, right? Where you go through all of this trauma through this movie, many people die. I don't think that gives away too much. It's a vampire movie. People are gonna die. But there's a moment where they just gave us a little hope at the end, right? They gave us something where we felt like we could fight that. And so like I thought that was just really important. Again, when we're talking about telling stories, using speculative fiction, using fantasy, right, as an allegory. The vampires in that movie were very much an allegory in telling that story. So I just wanted to compare those two sort of like two stories, very important when talking about Black characters, and the way that you could just shift that or, use that power of storytelling to give you sort of a different idea of a future or things like that.
Something I think that I could talk about after that. I thought about Get Out. So, for those that may not have seen Sinner, Get Out actually had two different vendors. And Jordan Peele talked about he had did test screening. And for those that don't know Get Out, I am about Get Out. For at the ending of Get Out, the ending we saw, TSA friend comes and saves it, right? And it really was that moment where the police car had pulled up, and there's actually a version where it was the actual police, right? And what is this? What is this black man Daniel Kaluuya going to say about they're trying to put my brain in someone else and they're piloting people to the police, right? But I think what we our understanding with Queen and Slim was the sci-fi aspect of it is taking that real aspect of our interactions with police, the real aspect of our interactions with capitalism, with people wanting to take advantage of our talents, right? Because I think between Get Out and Sinners, both of those are allegories about this industry wanting to take advantage of underrepresented talent, right? Um, and we're thrown back into reality when we know Bonnie and Clyde, right? But my day might be a little better if I know they meant to cute. We know like those interactions of being on some space just like Get Out, where we feel like everybody's looking at us. They know I'm an artist and they're wanting something from me, almost feeling like they want my talent. And now I have to deal with getting thrown back into my body of the police coming, right? And this, who was the villain, this white woman running after me with a gun, right? Now I'm back into the reality of, there being an invisible police around this white woman. The police not coming to me the way that they'll come to other people, right? And I think that's the aspects of sci-fi that we really yearn for, right? Like, just give me this, right? So that I don't have to deal with the reality of the situation right now.
I think that's the piece, right? I'm glad you mentioned that. So when we're talking about, the post-apocalyptic shows or books and, sort of this doom, this feeling of doom or dread, I think within those, what makes them good stories are those elements of hope, right? And so, all of these things are happening, they feel undefeatable. They feel, inevitable. But within those, and at least the very good storytelling ones, are those moments of hope. And it's usually a protagonist that's there to fight back and to rebel. And I think that's also, that nugget of how this makes the difference between just this doom, but then also like, yes, this is a warning, but we're also giving you a guide that like, don't have to accept this, right? It doesn't have to be this way. And I think that's really important because it's like we seem to get that when we're reading the books, when we're watching the movies, but in the real world, it's like we don't seem to like the rebel. Like we don't seem to like the person that's protesting, that's doing the things, and like we root for the underdog in these stories and then seem to forget to support the underdog in real life. Because then we can no longer remove ourselves, right? It becomes personal, and then we have to look at how we're complicit in the thing. And we don't want to think about how we're complicit in the thing. And so when, we see that person protesting, we see what, people call radical, and some of the things that people call radical, that's really me wanting the best for other people. It's not really that radical. And so we then have to like really look internally at, how we play a part in this, and be uncomfortable in those moments. We talked about that early on in the conversation, that part of having these dialogues is being uncomfortable, and it's okay to sit in discomfort, right? It's okay to also not know all the answers, right? But part of that first process starts by having conversation and realizing, oh shoot, am I complicit in this? How do we then move from there?
So I get since you said y'all thinking of a couple of things. Because we're talking about sci-fi. I know the Netflix movie do about the capital a lot of those end of the world movies, right? Because not only there's the apocalypse, right? Sometimes is that what it takes for people to realize it, right? The end of the world. So some of those movies, I realize a lot of people are like saying that's not gonna happen. That's it's just entertainment. But what I thought about was there was a moment in 1833, the Leomid meteor storm, right? So there's literally a storm, meteors, and this is the time where you are enslaved, right? They're enslaved and folks on the farms, and they saw this meteor shower and thought it was nothing to do, to the point where they set free all their snuff, or set free all the people that were enslaved, right? So when we talk about what people are currently knowing, right? You know that this is wrong. Know that there's no money. You know that what you're doing is terrible. But it took the end of the world, like you're thinking that the end of the world was coming, for you in that moment to really be like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm saying my whole fathers and I'm releasing folks and like do all these things, right? So I think a lot of the times when we say those things, it's sad, but yes, because you're gonna have those people that until the meteor falls, right? Of Don't Look Up, people were like, oh, snappy lie, like there is a meteor, right? But those are those moments where I think we do have to hold folks in the fire to say, no, this is like really the issue. Know that this is the problem. You're just too complacent and comfortable to give up those things because you insulated yourself, right? But that was an instance of where, kind of fix you to like reality of they thought the sky was falling and they knew they had to rectify their issue, rectify their ball.
So the last rule that we have in this book is count on the surprises. So we've talked a lot about, sort of like these rules or these steps predicting the future. But Octavia kind of ends it with, never really know what's going to happen. As you mentioned, the future is not set in stone. And so she talked about, being in a class in the 90s and people sort of not even really believing sort of what folks were going through during the Cold War. And just being, again, 10 years, 15 years removed from a situation and people having this completely different perspective. And during that time, people didn't think it was going to end the way it did, right? Really thought there was going to be nuclear war. They didn't see another future outside of that. So she really just talks about, you know, at the end of the day, you always count on the surprises, count on the unexpected to happen as, or again, we're thinking about these features and we're thinking about these things. And so she mentions, so why do we do this? Why are we making these predictions if, the future is so hard to tell? And so I really loved this quote as well when she talks about, we do this because it's a way of giving warning, as we've talked about many times in this talk. And when we see ourselves drifting into dangerous directions, those are those moments in times where you get these books, when you get, Parable of the Sower and you get all these other really important speculative fiction novels, is because folks are seeing these sort of red flags. They're seeing these things that we want to say, hey, we're drifting this way and maybe we need to course correct.
I had a link in the past that I want to tie to this just because I want to talk about this from like true this, right? Because a lot of times, you know, you can be in that point of like, okay, so how can I possibly write this book, make this film, write this poem? Um, and I want to just tell the story of James Cameron in Avatar. So I brought up back my grad because I wanted to share this story because it's interesting. Um, so for all of you know Navi, the blue people, it seems like aliens, Pocahontas for aliens, right? Uh, the music is very interesting in Avatar because James Cameron spent all this money trying to do his allegory, and then these later on it comes out that the people that made the music of it, he fought them tooth and nail on like how to make this more trap. And so I always say this in a point we talk about the surprises is he hit like the highest people of all the music, all the universities, and they came, ready to make something very tribal, very alien, very unitive as far as like folk music, indigenous music. And here's this person leading with charge, and he's like, I want brass. I want this. And they're like, this sounds like Superman. This sounds European. This sounds, he's like, well, that sounds too alien. And they're like, you know, you're and right. And I want to come back to that moment because people hailed, Avatar as this such great, movie and allegory. However, the underbelly of that was everybody that was doing the work, we had to fight him tooth and nail, trying to make a sound that brought together a lot of indigenous underrepresented folks. So when I think about surprises, right, that was such an amazing opportunity to like make a sound of the unheard, and the surprise was the same person that started this charge was their biggest block. So, I say that to say when you are creating or when you get invited to create, be aware that the same person that is inviting you to that opportunity might be your biggest op, right? So, like, I share that story so that more people understand that, as well as finding yourself either as the creative or the person that's organizing that, right? Be prepared for the surprises that you may be making the wrong decision, maybe making the wrong decision creatively, or you may have overlooked someone and overtalked someone and need to sit back in your privilege and really listen to more folks. And definitely it is the responsibility as creatives, right? When we're in these spaces. I think of Ironheart's coming out. How many of y'all heard about Ironheart's coming out? Exactly. How many of y'all seen the trailer? Exactly. Ironheart is a young black woman that's in Marvel, right? Okay, that's making in a suit similar to Iron Man, right? They had to turn the comments off on the video because there's so much hate for seeing a young black woman making the suit as a hero. They're dragging the comment, and then they even say, oh, top Marvel trailers that have the lowest score are She-Hulk, Iron Man, and the Marvels. All women led, right? So it is the responsibility of creatives to listen to those individuals that are underrepresented, as well as to stand up for them because we recognize Marvel has been promoting Ironheart like they should, right? As well as you see these conversations that are happening, right? But for some folks, that's not a surprise. But those are the big things I was trying to remind fellows, being creatives, that it's our responsibility to recognize and bring voices to those issues and those underrepresented folks. Sir.
Think that goes back to intention, right? That a lot of people who are creating, whether it's creating media or creating stories, may not always have the best intentions, right? And it can be a very fine line between um, telling a story and propaganda, or what is that difference? How are we telling a story? Are we giving warning, or is this propaganda as well? So I think intention is also really important when we think about how we're telling stories. What's the future that we're telling as well? We did want to end this on a positive note. And so one of the last quotes, they actually talk about this in the beginning of the book, but someone asks, so they're like, well, what's the answer? How do we solve this? And so she says, there's no single answer that will solve all of our future problems. There's no magic bullet. There are thousands of answers at least. You can be one of them if you choose to be. And so I thought that was really important. We talked about a lot of things. But I think at the end, right, the solution, first of all, there is no the solution, right? These many solutions, right? The many possibilities, the many variables are really down to us, right? Down to our choices, what we choose to do. And it goes back to even that earlier quote where everything that we touch, we change. Everything that we change changes us as well. And so I just want to remind you all of that and leave you with that last quote from Octavia as well. That I think it's really important that while we're doing these, we're talking about the future. We're talking about speculative fiction. How do we change the future? How do we predict the future? And that while all of this is up in the air, what we can control is our everyday actions, right? The choices that we make, how we be in community to each other, what do we owe each other, as people, as humans, and how we navigate through this world. Do you have any closing statements? And I do want to open it back up to the room one more time as well, before we close out. Anything else? Anyone else has anything they want to share?
So, before you had talked, I just thought about us making sure that we take care of ourselves, right? Can't call from the PT cut, but my myself saying that to my students. And then they're like, Josh, are you need to clean your cup? I'm like, all right, you got me. Like, let me take my own advice. But and then I think your gifts, right? The gifts are not your box. To be very aware of not only ways that you can give your gifts back, give your gifts to support each other, as well as ways that a lot of us steal, where ways that we can like big up and acknowledge the gifts that each have, right? Because even in that, I find myself saying like, hey, like I do want to reburn. What are some things that I could be to help me write this short story? And what is work need to like throw that out there as below. So I always remind you all, yes, take care of yourselves, work for the up and make sure that you are giving their gifts back.
And Tarife, thank you all for joining us for this discussion. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was interesting, informative, and hopefully a little bit inspiring as well.